Welcome to the Missions Podcast, the show that explores your hard questions on missions, theology, and practice to help goers think and thinkers go. I'm Alex Kochman, Director of Communications and Media with ABWE, joined by Scott Dunford, pastor of Redeemer Church in Fremont, California, and joined here in our new studio by a live in-person human guest. He's not an android, we're pretty sure. We did debate before coming on the air if you're the Mark Zuckerberg of ABWE or if you're the Elon Musk of ABWE.
I'm neither Elon Musk nor Mark Zuckerberg.
You're the Andrew
I'm
of
Andrew.
ABWE.
There
and
we
so
go.
I don't want to disclose too much about your identity. As everyone knows, sometimes we talk to people whose identities are treated as more secure because of the work that they do globally. But we do want to give you a chance to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do here at ABWE.
Yeah, my name's Andrew. I lead a ministry here at ABWE called Live Global, which we focus on equipping nationals to reach their own people and their own cultures with the gospel. We passionately cultivate edifying relationships between the North American church and believers across the globe to multiply gospel impact in their communities and beyond.
Great. That's very cool. You had all of that like memorized and perfectly packaged. And can you do that like backwards? Can you do that forwards? Can you do that with your eyes closed? Yeah. That's cool. So you might be an android. Maybe after all.
I am an Android user, if that counts.
That might be the one mark against you, actually, in the course of this interview. So we'll see what happens here. But we do want to talk to you a little bit about how you came to be at ABWE. So you're a missionary.
I am a missionary.
But you live here in Harrisburg.
I do.
And you spend a lot of time on the computer.
Fair bit.
So how does that work? Tell us about your calling, your background in tech, how you got here, and what does any of that mean? What is your background?
Yeah, I felt called to missions from a young age, and the Lord just doing many different things in my life. Went to Bible college, and while in Bible college, paid my way through by doing computer programming, started my own web business. And then when I got out, jumped into, rather than ministry right away, into the tech world. Jesus didn't start his earthly ministry till he was in his 30s. I realized that at 21, I probably didn't know everything I needed to.
That could be a podcast by itself, that sentiment
would be huge.
Yes.
So served in my local church, volunteered in my local church in a number of ways with the goal to do missions long-term. Got a job at a Fortune 20 company doing, tech stuff, computer programming. By the time I left there, I was managing about 80 people who were building a multi-billion-dollar e-commerce system. And that transition was really through my local church, the Lord affirming a call towards missions and the timing for missions, and wanted to jump in and just serve partners, serve the church globally. And really throughout that journey, post-missions, began to realize that technology was not just a filler stage in my life. Technology was a key skill set to really serve the global church and serve the North American church and missionaries as well in that.
So, Andrew, most of us that are coming into the ministry world, like the one program I use is Logos. And beyond that, even with Logos, I struggle. And part of it's just I'm getting older, but part of it is that's just not my focus. You have a unique focus in that your background and you've got a lot of experience in the tech world. And as missionaries, sometimes we get nervous about technology and even our safety. So tell us, from your perspective, is missions getting safer or less safe globally, especially as it relates to our online presence? And why would that be?
Yeah, missions is changing dramatically, and technology brings kind of two sides of that same coin. One is technology is unlocking mission opportunities we've never had before. But the flip side is technology has created unique challenges for missions. And in that, in some ways, much more things to watch out for, much more pitfalls, and in some ways, more danger.
So one of the things that we do is you and I serve together, just a little bit of the underhood here.
Yeah.
We serve together at ABWE on one of our committees that basically determines some of the technological direction that the mission takes. Without getting into too much of that, what that means is that we're often talking about the state of technology, the state of the world, the state of how protected are ABWE missionaries. So what are you seeing globally as far as maybe some of the threats against missions, especially from a technological standpoint, in ways that people are trying to exploit people online?
Yeah, probably a few stories of what we've actually experienced would be helpful. We have one guy who's trying to get into India, and was denied entry because not what he had on his Facebook, but he was friends with enough people who those friends identified that they worked for ABWE. And we know how Facebook works. If you have 30 friends who all are employed by the same company, that probably means you know them because you're employed by that same company. It was like, even in some ways, out of his control. He could have tweaked his settings a little more to lock that down. But that's not something we think of like compromising identity. There's somebody else who was blackballed from China because something they had on a YouTube account. And then a third instance, we had somebody, I won't even mention the country, but somewhere in Asia, a country that's turned more hostile towards Christianity and the spread of the gospel. People who were pumping churches that he spoke at to try to get information on him. The church had put up that he was speaking in the church, and then people within weeks of that were clearly non-U.S. citizens pumping that church for information on him while he was going through a visa process. And so I think these are just a few examples of unique ways we need to watch out for technology and habits. And that doesn't even touch the whole topic of how mission orgs, I think, can be targeted and are being targeted in their centralized data as well.
Scott, you want to get in with a question?
Yeah, I mean, just a comment. I mean, I've had the opportunity to visit other organizations and kind of see under the hood, and even some organizations that are larger than ABWE, and the numbers of attacks, cyber attacks that they experience on a daily basis was astounding to me. And then when I was at headquarters overseeing the tech side of things, realizing just how almost daily our teams were having to deal with hackers. So talk a little bit about that, if you could, as much as you know. Like, one, maybe talk about missionaries that aren't in restricted access places. Do they have to be careful? And if so, be careful of what? And then also, just from an organizational standpoint, I think it'd be helpful or interesting for people to hear what are the kinds of things that an organization, even like ABWE, is constantly dealing with.
Yeah. So the two questions of the first one you mentioned of missionaries that aren't in restrictive countries, I would say they need to be careful, but in a different way. And I liken digital security similar to physical security, right? Like, I lock the front door on my house every night. I lock all the other doors on my house. Like, it's no good if your front door is locked and your back door is open. But at the same time, like, could somebody circumvent that? Yes, but you want to put reasonable care there. If you live in a bad part of town, you take the security of your house far more seriously than if you live in maybe a safer part of town, but you still take home security seriously regardless of where. So if you're a missionary in an open country, we like to point out three things. One is your country could change. And we've seen countries over the course of our time with ABWE that we went from very open to very closed. Myanmar went through a military coup a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. Huge. The second thing is missionaries can be led to new places. And we know people that were called to one country, and then 10 years later, the Lord called them to another spot, and suddenly their online presence jeopardized what they were doing. And then third is you're part of a global team. So kind of going back to that Facebook example, you may say, like, I have no security risk to everybody knowing what I do here. But if you're just as careless in how you interact with other workers who maybe do have that security risk, you could inadvertently jeopardize them and not even know it.
Well, one of the things that has come up in our internal conversations about how do we do some strategic long-term planning for the state of our missions efforts, really our conversations over the last 2 years have changed dramatically. I mean, in 2020 and 2021, as we were having conversations, I remember distinctly the conversations that we were having when Amazon Web Services canceled Parler. Whatever you think of Parler as an alternative social media company, you have to admit it's a little bit alarming when a theoretically neutral platform, of course there's no neutrality in the world, but an ostensibly neutral platform is eliminating people because of their ideological beliefs, right? And that's, we see that politically, but of course we've seen that in missions for a long time because of people's spiritual convictions too. And missionaries have had to deal with that in some of these very hard places like China that you've mentioned. But they're also dealing with it in other places in the West that were never on paper closed to missionaries. Now it's a global thing. So what are you counseling the missionaries that you work with when questions come up about cancel culture, about all of what that means? How does that affect missions?
Yeah, that's a really nuanced question. Could be an entire podcast even on its own. Cancel culture isn't new. It's just different. right? I mean, we know stories of people in villages in Africa that when they became saved, they weren't allowed to go to the well anymore. They were canceled, basically what we would call core services cut off. And in some ways, cancel culture of, revoking technology platforms is a modern day equivalent of that. Will that come? I don't know. Probably. Big tech, when you look at the big four, none of them are fond of what we're doing in the end. But when that comes, what that looks like, I would say hey, use the tools as we can today, as honestly as we can, and be ready for the day that we can. But we're...
So a follow-up question related to that then. We, in the missions world, traditionally distinguish between restricted access and open countries, or limited access too. So there's countries that are completely closed and restricted. There's countries where that access is limited. There's countries where, and this is sometimes the same as the limited group, creative access is another term that's used. You can get in, but you've got to have some kind of a unique platform to get in. And then there's just a country that's wide open that, religious worker visa, come on in, right?
Yep.
Do you think, though, from where you're seated, that those are outdated paradigms because what's happening at a technological level really transcends all of those geopolitical boundaries that we've drawn up those lines upon?
In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. But the world is rapidly shifting. It's shifting in our use of technology. I mean, I like to tell people, I've been to a dozen countries over a 2-year time span, and the worst cell service I got was here in Pennsylvania. True. I've watched slum kids in Surabaya play Pokemon Go. And, we've seen people in garbage dumps in Guatemala that they live in a garbage dump their entire life, and they own smartphones. Technology is everywhere. So it's changing the landscape. It's changing how we approach things. And the pace of change globally is picking up. When you look throughout history, it took a long time for countries to change or positions to change, and we're seeing that accelerate now. And I think technology is one of the driving factors behind that.
Scott, you want to cut in?
It's so interesting. I experienced that. I've been in the middle of absolutely nowhere. We're in the middle of the backside of really remote countries and had perfect cell phone service. And technology is everywhere. As we deal, though, with state actors going after organizations like ABWE, and I realize, this isn't necessarily your fastball area, but why do you think, and maybe just help people understand, why would a state actor go after a small potatoes organization? I mean, even at our largest, and ABWE is a pretty large organization, but even the IMB or Pioneers or other organizations that are fairly large in the scope of things are nothing. Why would a state actor go after an organization like this? And why would that be so important that they have good security within their organization?
Yeah, state actors go after a lot of things. The modern warfare is being waged in a cyber sense, not in a, old school sense in much of the world. But we got to recognize, I think, a few things. One, there's cultural things at play. I don't think we understand sometimes some of the honor shame culture as it interacts with a Christian religion in other cultures, and how they view some of what we're doing as bringing shame on the country.
Right.
I think there's spiritual factors at play. We have an enemy who's out to see us stop rather than advance, and he uses others. But Scott, to your point, we know ABWE has come under attacks. We don't know of any successful ones yet, praise God. But I know other organizations who have actually been successfully hacked, and within hours or days, all of their workers in that country were told to leave or escorted out. Even more dangerous is the fact that we're working with national believers who their threat is not being kicked out of the country. Their threat is sometimes their life. And so you had asked earlier, some of the things we're doing behind the scenes, we take security really seriously here at ABWE. And we've actually formed a volunteer group of ethical hackers. A lot of these guys who work for maybe their day job is working for the government or other cyber firms, who use their skills to attempt to hack into ABWE, to test the security of our systems and our data that we hold at a corporate level. And when they find things, we're able to quickly get them resolved, Lord willing, before bad actors get into them.
So what are some of the common mistakes then? If that's what ABWE is doing, what are we trying to mitigate against? What are some of the things that you see that missionaries most often accidentally do that are security issues?
And can I jump in on this? Because this is something that, is really, I experienced this. I mean, we worked in a restricted access place. there was always chatter about, oh, you should use this online system. And then other people would come back like, actually, no, Google is probably the safest. Gmail is your safest bet because of the level of encryption there. And there was always back and forth about what was safe and what wasn't safe. And it was really hard as a missionary to navigate, one, how to be like not so restrictive that you kind of draw attention to yourself that way. But on the other side, how to be safe and protect people while still being able to communicate with your churches and your friends and family back in your home. So I'm extremely interested in this one because it affected me personally. And I know that a lot of my teammates always were struggling with this question.
Yeah. And so when we talk about security, in my mind, I have three big buckets I'm looking at how to approach security. First is organizationally. So the data we hold here at ABWE, whether it's our donor data or missionary data or others, how do we make sure that's secure? And we have teams focused on that. Then there's missionaries, and it's what tools do missionaries use? How do they communicate? What do or don't they say? And then the third bucket beyond that is people not even part of the mission, pastors or family back home or others. Like, what do they do to help keep people safe? But Scott, to zoom in on that center one of missionaries, it really depends on where missionaries are, what is and isn't safe, the country and what they're doing and what tools they should use. There's some general rule of thumbs that we advise. Like right now we use Signal for all of our like text messaging or communication, from our phones instead of, WhatsApp or Facebook or normal texts or whatever. But part of it is just kind of developing these healthy habits of what you say, of who you're talking to, of what data you put out, of just how you kind of approach digital tools. And I think historically, like when you look at the early days of Facebook, there was kind of this idea of like, hey, we're free to be free with everything. You can share everything and it's really cool.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Do you ever like look at the things that you posted on Facebook like 15 years ago?
Yeah.
It's like back when updating it, basically it was your name and then fill in the blank afterwards. Yep. So like if you look at all my, it's like, is eating a sandwich, Alex Cookman is eating a sandwich. It was insane. Yeah, that's amazing. I'm employed.
Alex
honestly.
poked you. Want to poke him back?
Another Farmville request from Scott Dunford.
Yes.
Oh, man. Yeah, I think we've come to realize how much data gives away on us, but I don't think we realize the full extent of it.
No.
Of what our phones track, of what they call it digital exhaust. But this idea of like, seemingly meaningless pieces of data when pumped into algorithms with other large amounts of data are incredibly revealing about us and about what we do in ways we never imagined. And this isn't even government actors we're talking about. This is just big tech using it to sell us stuff. And advertising. Like there's a ton of data out there. So I think we're beginning to realize like we need to be careful what we put out. But I think there needs to be this realization that you never actually escape it, right? The speed of which you scroll on your smartphone, when you choose to pull your smartphone out, who you choose to be next when you do it, what apps you open, all of that is not meaningless data. It's incredibly revealing. And it's kind of funny and kind of scary, like how that's used. But beyond that, I mean, grocery stores 10 years ago were tracking where you walked in the store using infrared sensors and how fast you walked, and were able to predict when you would check out. They use facial recognition to track like who's together and what you're buying and what your patterns are. Like, even if you said, I'm never going to have a laptop, I'm never going to have a smartphone, I'm going old school, like you're not going to escape this. It's the world we live in.
It's like the Minority Report. We've got psychics and petroleum jelly laying there, telling it. But in reality, we're scanning everything. We've always been doing that.
If I can follow up one more of that as it relates to missionaries, there was a theory that we had on the ground, and that was that there was a way to be too secure.
Yeah.
And there was some people that we saw all of a sudden they're gone, and they weren't with our organization, obviously. And it was like the most secure people we met. They were super careful. They never did anything wrong. And the theory, and it was just a theory, was that they were too secure, that there wasn't enough of them for the state actors that we were involved with, that they knew a little bit about us, but they didn't know anything about these people. And then all of a sudden, boom, They were gone. While other people who were very open, but not insultingly open, were able to function. Do you have a theory about that or any input onto that?
Yeah, when you read the history of missions, it's not uncommon for missionaries to be mistaken as spies or even something worse than what they are. I mean, like even you read like Adoniram Judson, like was dealing with that. Like, are you a spy here? And I think that happens in a digital way now. If they can't get anything on you, like what do you have to hide? And so that's why I like counsel people. Like my advice is not get off of all of your social media platforms. If you're a millennial, like people expect millennials to be on social media.
Right.
What you're doing should kind of jive and not bring shame to your country. And yeah, because Scott, you're exactly right. Like
that's key too, not bring shame to your country. So sometimes it's not just like you're a Christian, we're going to persecute you. Sometimes it's like, hey, just how does this reflect on us as a country? And we don't want our reputation tarnished with our neighbors, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a big thing most missionaries don't normally understand maybe when they're entering into missions, or even some Westerners. It's not always so much whether you're a Muslim or atheist or militant, Hindu context maybe. It may not even be as much that you're a Christian that they hate. It's that you're a Christian who's trying to flaunt that the government can't see or can't catch you, or that somehow you've outsmarted them, or that you're just kind of shaming the local imams or the local government. In America, like criticizing our government's like a national sport, I think. In other countries, that brings a death sentence.
Yeah.
And so we don't realize that like every person, when you enter into a country, they're weighing the pros and the cons. Like, do you bring more value than or less value? And that's why sometimes they're really open people. It's because they're winsome and because they're like bringing great value and they're doing it wise as serpents and harmless as doves, that they're not kicked out.
Before I get into some of the, we want to talk about the practicalities. What can you do to tighten up your online presence? What can you do if you're a pastor that cares about missions, to be thinking about these things even from now? There's people in my church that we want to mobilize, right? And so how can they have a clean digital footprint from now? And I want to get there, but let me throw two scenarios at you, and you tell me if you think I'm onto something or if I'm way off. Okay, deal?
Okay, deal.
All right. So I think a lot of us can easily picture how these things play out in the context like East Asia or an Islamic country, right, where the government is directly opposed to you. I've had two conversations lately, though, that are in a different context, but that raise security concerns. One is I had a conversation recently with somebody who's very open in discussing his background coming out of the LGBT community, and if you can call it that, but very open about that, doing ministry, preaching the gospel, right? Yep. Seeking to disciple people. This individual has a real concern that he would get doxxed, right, by engaging publicly in that way. And my counsel in a conversation about this person was maybe we should just treat him more like you would treat a missionary to a Muslim country. Yeah. Right. That, and in this way specifically, similarly to you, Scott, you reached a point where you realized, hey, I'm the host of the Missions podcast, so I'm probably never going to have a totally clean digital footprint. And so you sort of made peace with that. This individual either needs to make peace with being the public figure talking about these things, but then not being able to do a lot directly, or being completely under the radar and having total openness to go wherever and talk to whomever, right? That's one situation. The other situation actually was just last night. We had a meeting at our local crisis pregnancy center. And at the time of this recording, we're waiting for the Roe decision to come. And we had a very transparent conversation about Jane's revenge and about the security risks right now with crisis pregnancy centers being attacked. And the ongoing dynamic between the people that are giving compassionate care there versus the people that are vigiling and praying and preaching directly in front of a Planned Parenthood. And we want that to be a good relationship because we're all on the same team. You know, we're on the back end and they're on the front lines. But should we be directly pointing people to each other? Should we know that there's any affiliation between the people on the front lines and the people in the back office of a crisis pregnancy center? And again, the conversation came up there of, well, it's like you would treat a missionary in a Muslim country, that they shouldn't talk about their agency and the agency shouldn't talk about them because we want to keep a clean line of separation. But we know we're on the same team. That doesn't mean that we're opposed to each other. So am I completely coming from left field with some of these, you know, kind of forced analogies and metaphors to missions? Or is that accurately, increasingly kind of describing the climate that we're in and the way that anyone in ministry anywhere should approach issues of security?
Yeah, I think you're onto something. I think that the two things worth mentioning, like that, both of those are completely new scenarios for our country.
Yeah.
Right? Like people coming out of the LGBTQ environment right as it's really kind of reaching its full fury. Like we don't have 100 years or 1,000 years of history to draw on. Like how do we do that well? But we have principles and concept we're drawing from that. And even with the Roe decision, it's hard to know what happens when it drops, but what happens a year later?
Yeah.
Or what does that look like? And when you look at missions, like one of the beauties of reading missions is you realize that people have approached these different ways over the generations, and there's not just one right answer. And even in the New Testament, we see times where risk is wholly embraced, right? Like if you go there, they're going to kill you. I'm like, well, I'm going. And times that, Paul's being lowered out of a window. And even the history of ABWA, I love reading like during World War II, how ABWA approached it of like, there's risks and we've prayed and we've, counted the cost and we think this is right. I think we're going to see more and more of that when it comes to even our analogies here with LGBTQ or Roe of different people are going to handle it different ways. And it requires wisdom. It requires a body to prayerfully engage it. But that idea of balancing risk and ministry is really what we're talking about.
Absolutely. Scott, why don't you hop in?
Yeah, this is a fascinating conversation. I'm really glad that we could do this. I think there's a lot of missionaries and pastors that are just like trying to sort this out, and everything's changing so fast. That's the hard thing is that, it's within my lifetime. We've gotten email and we watched things like the Jetsons and couldn't imagine a watch that you could talk into or being able to do a face-to-face call like this. And here we are, and it's continuing to change. So what would you say to pastors or supporters? Honestly, when we lived in a restricted access place, our pastors and supporters were actually pretty good about the protocol. It was our family that would just forget and say, we'd say like the M word, don't say the M word. Because it's just, it goes back to that shaming the culture we were in, the missionary word. So how could you encourage pastors and supporters what they can do to help their loved missionaries that are serving in these places instead of hurting them?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would counsel is not to be paralyzed by fear. Because I've met some that like the idea is like, oh, if I say anything, I'm going to jeopardize somebody. And I'd say like, well, no, anybody who goes overseas, like that government expects that they have friends back home. So like be friends and encourage them. But as you do that, like be careful kind of in three ways. And you take your cue from the person you're talking to of what apps do you use to communicate with them? How do they prefer to be communicated with? Be careful in what you say in private conversations with them. And again, taking your cue kind of from them. I would say anybody who's in a restricted access or creative access area, any concept of proselytization should be completely off limits in conversation. Just because like that.
And you're not saying don't proselytize.
Oh no, don't. No, I'm not
saying don't talk about proselytizing.
I'm saying don't brag about it.
Yeah.
Or in what they would say, brag about it. Like, yeah, absolutely do it. Be faithful.
You don't want to see all the notches on my evangelistic buckle.
But talking about how like you just shared the gospel with a Muslim and you think he'll come to faith in Christ and you can't wait to baptize him could have a lot of implications for that Muslim that you never thought about.
Imagine if the whole country came to Christ and what that would do to the government. Yeah, right.
Oh man, Sharia law would be gone. It's amazing. Be careful what you talk about, and even their government. Like we can be frustrated with other people's governments, but like I wouldn't vent that with the person living there because you even put them in an awkward spot when you do that. But then the third thing, and this is also like critically important, is be really careful what you publish online. And so especially if you're a pastor or you're a church, like this happens so inadvertently. Missionary prayer letters get on a website. Missionary names get put on a website, or they preached in church, so we just live streamed it to the world.
Especially with COVID, right? Because now the whole service is live streamed, even if you're a church of 50.
Yeah, I mean, post-COVID, like it just became second nature that you have to put everything online. But this creates kind of new challenges and puts people in risky situations. So like just being proactive, because sometimes, that missionary will be really thoughtful and say like, hey, don't live stream me, or don't put my name online, or don't put my prayer letter online. But sometimes like they're tired or catching up from jet lag, or have young kids, or, just kind of scrambling, and they don't even think to talk, or they tell the pastor, but they forget to tell the AV guy, and the AV guy didn't hear from the pastor, and he just does what he does every Sunday, and suddenly it's online. And So I think those three things, like if you're stateside communicating with a worker, the first would be just use the apps that worker is comfortable with. So if they want Signal, like hop on Signal. If they're comfortable with email, then use email, but stay in touch with them. Don't abandon them or ghost them. The second would be careful in what you say in private conversations. That's best hashed out before they go. If they're already there, my rule of thumb would be don't bring something up until they bring it up. I mean, if they never bring up how church is going there and they're in Southeast Asia or whatever, like until they do, be careful, kind of read the room. And then third would be when it comes to what you put publicly, like be especially guarded. And my rule of thumb is don't publish something until you get express permission to publish it. Because even we've run into scenarios where somebody, like, their name is all over the internet and what they're doing, but what's not connected is who they're working with. And drawing just those connecting dots is what the digital game is now, of location to people, to ministry, to partners, to other missionaries. And our goal is to break as many of those connections as possible.
So devil's advocate.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be the missions podcast if we didn't, toss these ideas around a little bit and tinker with them and dig in. Is it possible to be too neurotic, too scrupulous about security if somebody's going to a particular country, maybe where there's less risk? Have you seen a situation where someone's like, no, we can never talk about it, we can never say anything that's happening, to the point where somebody doesn't even know, like, well, you can still tell stories of what God is doing. You just have to hide names, or you just have to, not tell me which country you're in, but still get the good news out for your people, your supporters, to be praying for you. Is there a lack of a middle ground that people sometimes see?
Oh, absolutely. But this isn't new to technology. My grandparents were missionaries. They did Bible printing, and they would tell stories of people who would smuggle Bibles into Mexico when you could freely drive them. When you could freely drive them across the border.
Yep.
But they would hollow out the doors of their car and stuff Bibles in them.
A lot more fun to smuggle them, though.
And the funny thing is, like, customs knew what they were doing, and these people thought they were, like, being really sneaky. Like, that's not new. And sometimes I think there's a danger in missionaries almost feel a little more validated by hyping up the risk or hyping up the security.
Yeah.
And so we love...
You're not a CIA agent.
Yeah.
Like, settle down.
And so it's totally possible to... I try to, just as a rule of thumb, like, respect, like, where the missionary is. Even if they're oversensitive, like, it's not the job of a pastor to override that, because maybe they are too sensitive. Maybe there's more factors going on than what we know. And I've learned that even working with partners of, like, I don't know why they're so sensitive. Like, you're in the country you're in or the location, but then you kind of begin to realize, like, no, there's a certain people group they're working with, or there's a certain something, or there's somebody else in government they're talking with that isn't apparent right away. But I would also, like, counsel missionaries, like, God is doing things, and we do talk, and we, like, you will not escape the risk digitally, and you just need to be wise and sensible about it, not just try to shut everything down altogether.
A couple of thoughts on that, just from my own experience. One is, even being here as a pastor, recognizing that I'm dealing with all sorts of people. There's parts of my story I don't share with everybody, simply because how that's going to be received in those initial conversations and connections with people. When I'm working with certain people groups, especially, and I talk about what I did before, I don't bring that up in the front part of it, because I realize that will be shaded in a way that doesn't accurately reflect me or the ministry I want to have. But I do lead with being a pastor. I do lead with being a Christian. And even when we were overseas, I kind of learned some things the hard way. And that is, don't say something in your story that later on you could possibly regret. So, they teach you to create a box, and this is the box you live in about your background, your story. And people were curious, like, how does a guy that's 30 some years old with 4 kids just move over here and just live and go to school? And they wanted to know a little bit about what we were doing and why we were studying and what our plans were. And so we created, a truthful, but certainly leaving out certain elements of the background. And I did not tell people that I had been a pastor. And it wasn't shocking to people once they did find that out, but it was weird with friends that I had initially that I would say, well, what did you do? And I told them what I did before, but I didn't bring up the part about being a pastor. And then I had one lady that we were working with, and we were sharing the gospel with her. We were becoming close. And at some point she just said to me, I just wish that I had a pastor that I could talk to about these things. And I was like, because I had put myself in this corner that now I was not able to get out of. And later on, I changed how we talked about with other people. And I said, I'm a businessman now. And I was like, that was true and legitimate in the States. I had been a pastor, and that wasn't illegal for me to have been a pastor in the past. It wasn't, it wasn't wrong, and it didn't jeopardize my security because, one, they expected me to be a Christian because I was an American. They assumed I was Christian. And so that part of it didn't freak anyone out. But it also did open, when people did have spiritual questions, it identified me as a person that they could go to. So it was one of those things of like learning as you go and trying to make sure that you're being safe, but also not putting yourself in a ministry box that you're not going to be able to get out of later without, looking like a liar. And so, I think that might be a helpful story for some people.
And that's a personal example of that. But even like with your visa, like if you're there on an NGO visa, well, guess what? You got to do NGO work now. So you might not be able to plant a church because you could have gotten a religious worker visa, but instead you went and got an NGO platform instead. I mean, that happens.
Yeah. And Scott, you brought up something that I think is really important for people to realize, which is it's actually good for most missionaries in most places. I don't make universal statements, but it's good to actually identify yourself as a Christian coming in.
Yes.
For a few reasons. One, we tend to think like you'll be kicked out of other countries if they find out you're a Christian. Mm-hmm. That's not why you get kicked out of countries. They assume you're a Christian. Like we would assume if somebody came here from Pakistan, they're a Muslim. Like we wouldn't be surprised. Like, oh, really? Like, and we don't realize like I remember when I was in Indonesia, like they just assumed everybody in America was a Christian. And one of the hangups, I was in a conversation with a guy, he was talking about like, he would never become a Christian. He was a good Muslim because he saw how Britney Spears lived. And if that's how Christians lived, he could never be a Christian. Uh-huh. And so the idea, like I tell people like, you don't have to pretend you're not a Christian. In fact, you should embrace that so that opens doors for you down the road when they're looking for someone spiritual. Or it would create like weird things of like, when you do share the gospel, like, wait, you actually believe that? Like, I didn't, the flip side is like, how do you represent yourself online? That when I'm standing at a customs counter, they may think here's a white guy who's a Christian from America, but I don't want them to think that I'm one of those radical, crazy Christians that wants to see every person in the world come to know and love Jesus based on my interaction with them at a customs counter.
Yeah, at the customs counter.
At the customs counter.
Excuse me, officer, if you were to die tonight,
right.
where would you go?
Who do you work for? Well, the Association of Baptists for World Evangelism.
Right, just be smart, yeah.
Yeah, and Alex, actually that question is not as offensive as, talking about spiritual things is what, that's one thing I loved working about with Muslim people, like talking
very
about
true.
Spiritual stuff all the time. It was actually the identification of missionary work with what's happened historically. And, we would argue probably the mischaracterization of colonialism and the effects of those in those countries, even more so than a direct spiritual question. And it's understanding those things and not even what we think is true, but how it's perceived in that place. And the stories, the legends, the mythology surrounding that period of their history, that they're sometimes, like for instance with China, it's very much about trying to get rid of the imperialist past and focus on the future, and anything that reminds them of what happened in they call it the humiliation of China, which is really the great, many times that was when great missionary work was being done, they want to get rid of. And so it's just an interesting dynamic of trying to think through, okay, how would they perceive this, and how am I representing myself in that situation or not?
And this is not going away. So without being doom and gloom, I think people have been amazed by just big tech. We'll just pick on big tech again for a minute over the last 2 years of how much has changed and how easy it is to get suppressed online or platformed online, depending on whether or not you're towing a certain ideological line that allies with the secular sort of spirit of the age. This isn't going away anytime soon. It's going to start affecting people in the U.S. here as much as missionaries have been dealing with it for a long time. We've got to get used to it and recognize that there's a way to be faithful. There's a way to be bold. There's a way to be proclamational in evangelism without unwisely putting yourself, your partners, your teammates at a direct risk that could have been easily avoided otherwise, right?
Yeah.
What final thoughts would you give to missionaries, potential missionaries, pastors, people that are here in the States just kind of watching this and think, I didn't sign up for all of this. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would say today's a really unique age. We have tools unimaginable, like what Scott was talking about earlier, that we get to take advantage of. And I'd say let's take advantage of those, but let's recognize they're just tools. And that'll change. Like the church has thrived without technology. And as much as we kind of want to, forecast the future, like we don't know. Like it's funny, like watching the trajectory of Twitter, and then suddenly Elon Musk out of nowhere says, I'm buying Twitter and it'll be a free speech platform. And it's like, wait a minute, did not see that coming. And who knows if that even goes through.
I think it's supposed to.
They voted on it. We'll see.
Yeah.
But we don't know what the future holds. Yeah. I mean, even when you look at big tech, like the big tech now wasn't the big tech 15 years ago. There's underdogs coming. Things change. Things change rapidly.
Yeah.
But for believers, I would say be wise as serpents, harmless as doves, and take advantage of everything we have now for the advancement of the kingdom. And that would be missionaries, take advantage of what you have and use it wisely. Pastors and supporters and senders, like get on board, use it wisely, work with missionaries. And techies, use your skills for missions. If you want to join our programming team, our volunteer programming team, or our volunteer ethical hacking team, we even have a bug bounty program out there.
What?
A bug bounty.
A bug bounty program.
It's for those who
come to my
don't
backyard.
know.
I've got a lanternfly infestation. I don't think that's what you mean, though.
For those who are unfamiliar, bug bounty programs work where if you can actually exploit the system following the rules of the game, and you let us know and we're able to patch it, we actually pay out cash rewards for that. So liveglobal.org/hacking is where you can find details about that. If you want, more details of how to get involved, just contact us through liveglobal.org. You can hit contact us on there. If you're another smaller mission org that wants just some of the tips and guidelines we use. Or bigger, we can share with you some of the guidelines we use internally when we train up our workers to send them out. But you just contact us through the website. Yeah, very cool. And if you want to get more information, you can also come through Scott and I. Since Andrew, we like to keep you a little bit more removed and a little bit more secure, but Alex at missionspodcast.com, Scott at missionspodcast.com. And very last but not least, use a VPN. Yeah. Always use a VPN. Well, use a VPN. The thing I would say even more, set up multi-factor authentication on every device you can. Like, I don't care if you're a missionary, if you're just an average Joe here. The other month, I had a girl come up to me. Her Facebook got hacked. And the hacker, after guessing her password, changed the email address on it, reset the password, and totally locked her out. So she has no way to even recover that. Use multi-factor authentication. That's where it like texts you a code if you log in from a brand new device. Set it up on your bank, set it up on social media, on your email. Well, this very podcast got hacked about a year ago. It was this month. It was exactly 1 year ago that a Russian hack took this podcast out. Yeah. So when people say, I don't like that episode, we like, that was a hacker. That's right. It's actually been very convenient for us. That's right. Absolutely. It'll be really embarrassing if after this drops, you get hacked again. We're definitely going to have to make sure that everything's up to snuff now, for sure. We don't want to be eating crow. So let's quit while we're ahead. Andrew, so glad that you could be here. Great to be here. Thank you. So glad that you and your family are a part of the ABWE family and that Live Global's a part of it. We're thrilled that all the ways that God is working and moving. Well, you may know by now that the Missions Podcast is a ministry of ABWE. To get more information, go to abwe.org. But to get more content, go to missionspodcast.com. Of course, you can find this podcast on YouTube, on ABWE's channel, or wherever podcasts are found. And in your podcast platform of choice, this is super important. Go ahead. If you haven't done this yet already, we're asking you, it does legitimately help get this content in front of other people that can be blessed by it. Go ahead and leave a positive review, a 5-star rating, especially if you're using Apple Podcasts. Sorry, you're an Android user, but if you're an Apple guy, if you're an iOS person, then this next step is for you. That'll help other people be blessed by the content. And we also value your support, and you can find out how to show your support at missionspodcast.com/support. Until next week, thank you for watching and listening, and go download a VPN if you don't have one, right? There we go. Very good. Thanks, everybody.